All right, guys, come on in. We'll just wait one more minute for a couple of people to come in here. I'll get my folder open. So we're not going to have a super long lesson today, but we are going to finish off talking about population ecology. Okay. All right, so on the chat, if you can just give me a yes if you can hear me, that would be awesome. Okay, perfect. Sounds good. So what we're going to do is just open up the PowerPoint. Just to give you guys a heads up here, I finished marking the population ecology. I haven't returned it because I still have a couple outstanding from you guys. So they should be, I'll return them by the end of the day today, so you have them to study off of. Okay. And just minimize that for a second. Yeah, so on Monday, I will open up a populations unit test. So the unit test will be on population genetics and population ecology. Okay. And that'll be open Monday and Tuesday, and then Wednesday it'll close at noon. Okay. There is a couple of you that haven't written the population genetics quiz, so you need to make sure you get on that right away so I can open that up for everyone to take a look at the results. All right. Any questions about what's coming up? Okay, I don't see any, so I'm just going to open up the PowerPoint and we're going to finish off talking about population ecology. So we didn't have a whole lot left, so I don't think this will take us the full 45 minutes, which is fine because it gives you some time to review and study. Okay. Oh, yes, the other thing, I have a second population ecology booklet. That's what I was going to say, that I posted yesterday. You couldn't finish it because it's partly on what we're going to talk about today, but that will be due Monday at noon. Okay, so that's the second population ecology worksheet, and that was posted on Google Classroom yesterday, so that's due on Monday. Okay, so if you have questions on it, just ask me. I'm around all weekend, so that's fine. I'm not sure why it isn't working, Ethan. It looks like other people can hear me, so I don't know what's going on. All right, I am going to open up my PowerPoint here, share that with you guys, and like so. And we'll just go to where we need to be here in it. So just as I'm opening this, just a reminder that we will be starting endocrine system on Monday. Okay, we did logistic growth patterns, talked about all that fun stuff, skipped over that, talked about predation. Yes, symbiosis. All right, so we ended up at symbiosis, and there we go. So slideshow from here. Okay, can you guys see the slide? Just if I don't hear you, I guess that's what I'm doing here. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Emily. Okay, perfect. So we did this slide last class, so I'm just going to fast forward through this here. And go on. Symbiosis. So talk about this real quick because symbiosis is something you've learned about over many years. I remember teaching it when I taught grade 9. You've learned about it before grade 9. You've learned about it since grade 9. So, but it is in the curriculum. We do have to understand that symbiosis is a relationship. So we talk about predator-prey. Predator-prey is also a relationship between two organisms. Producer-consumer is a relationship between two organisms. But this is one of two different species that live in close proximity to one another, and then one always benefits. Okay. The other one might benefit, might be ambivalent, doesn't really care, or might be harmed by that relationship. Okay, so symbiosis, a relationship between two organisms of different species that live close to one another. All right, so 3 types. So the first type is mutualism. So mutualism, we can see a couple of examples here. So here we have our little rhino, and we've got this little bird. I believe it's called a tick bird, and it eats some of the little parasites that would otherwise affect the rhino. So it gets a meal, and the rhino doesn't get affected by these parasites. Okay. We see an example down here. So we see the butterfly, and it's collecting nectar from the flower, right? So the butterfly gets a meal and also collects pollen, inadvertently collects pollen. So when it goes to the other plant, cross pollination can happen, increasing the genetic diversity of the plant, right? So that's mutualistic. Over here, what we're looking at is these are villi. So that's inside our intestines, and these are little bacteria. So we have bacteria in our intestines that make vitamin K for us, right? So the bacteria are getting a meal, and then they're producing vitamin K, which is a benefit to us. Okay, so that's mutualism. So both parties benefit. All right, next we have commensalism. So commensalism is where one party benefits and the other species isn't hurt but doesn't gain anything either from that relationship. Okay, so that's what commensalism is. So the image that we see in the top right corner here, so this image, what we see is a shark, and then all these little fish that are kind of sucked onto the shark, those are remora. So the remora will eat some of the extra stuff that's sitting on the skin of the shark for extra food, but it also gets a ride. It doesn't have to use its energy in order to get somewhere. Um, so that's a benefit to it. And the other benefit is sharks go into this big feeding frenzy when it's time to have a meal. And these remora get to hang out and they get to have all the leftovers from that as well. Okay. So the remora benefit, shark doesn't care, doesn't really help it at all. Okay. If I look over here, what I'm seeing down here, this is a whale and it's got barnacles on it. And barnacles are these teeny, teeny, tiny little shelled creatures. You'll see them sometimes sitting on pilings by the ocean, and they usually affix to a surface. Now, the benefit to the barnacles, again, is they get some mobility. So they get access to food sources because they get food through kind of diffuses. Whatever gets to them, gets to them. But they get access to more food sources because they're carried around on the whale. Orchids. So orchids are flowers that will grow off of other plants, but they don't cause harm to the plant, but allows them to get higher to get more light. Okay. All right. So those are some examples of commensalism. And then lastly, we have parasitism. So of course, parasitism is kind of the grossest one. So it's the most fun one to talk about. And we have a couple of examples here. So if I look here on this side, on the upper right side of the page of the slide, what I see is a huge amount of fluid buildup here in the left leg where the right leg looks kind of normal. This is elephantiasis filiaris. And basically what it is it's caused by this little tiny parasite. And I believe the parasite's caused by a fly. So you're bit by this fly and it has a parasite in it. And what that parasite causes is it causes all the fluid from your capillaries to go into that interstitial fluid, causing edema. So if you look up elephantiasis on the internet, you'll get pictures of great big legs. Oftentimes it will cause the scrotum of a male to just totally expand. So there's fluid buildup in those regions. So people with this condition often aren't able to work. Here's a deer tick embedded into human skin. So we know that these guys cause Lyme disease. Usually you get this sort of bullet or bullseye kind of shape. And this is another condition. It's river worms. And this is another parasite. I believe this one is spread through mosquitoes as well. But anyway, what happens is this worm goes into the fluid, and we'll learn about this a little later. It's called the vitreous humor, and it's this gel-like fluid in our eye, and the worms live there. So as the worm passes where the light comes in, you're not going to be able to see, right? So it's called river blindness, and these little worms are kind of floating around. So it's a little gross. And we can see the areas where that particular parasite is indigenous. Okay. So tapeworms, that's our prime example. So basically anything that's going to cause harm to the host, right? So the parasite obviously benefits from this relationship, but it causes harm. Most of the time it doesn't cause death unless it's a really slow death, because death then takes away from the parasite being able to live, right? The parasite wants to suck all the energy out of its host. So it needs the host to be alive in order to do that. All right. So symbiosis. Any questions on symbiosis? All right. Not hearing any questions or seeing anything in the chat. We're just going to move on here. All right. So our very last section is on something called succession. Okay. So I showed you this when we first started the unit, and I just want to revisit this slide again, because succession really is all about the interactions between abiotic and biotic factors. When we talk about succession, succession is basically how an area or region slowly gets to where it becomes stable. So where it first starts, to a point where now we have a stable, diverse, complex kind of community where the number of organisms we have of each different type of species are going to stay pretty constant at that point. Okay. But when an area first starts, so if we talk about starting with rock, okay, so starting with rock could be like the formation of a volcanic island. When we start with just rock, it's going to take time for that to build up, right? Because eventually that rock has to become soil to be able to support vegetation. We need vegetation to be able to support animals, and so on and so on. So it's going to take time in order for that to happen. So when we start with nothing, right? Our abiotic factors, well, we've got lots and lots of sunlight. We don't really have much moisture, right? Because there's nothing to hang on to the moisture. So lots of sunlight, not a lot of moisture, no soil to speak of, right? And then we have something happen. So maybe a biotic factor, a little bit of dirt, and I told you this before, a little bit of seed comes down, and that seed can germinate. And as that seed germinates, it maybe breaks that rock up a little bit, right? And now we have a little bit more stuff there as more and more seeds maybe start to germinate. But it's just something little that can actually grow there, right? Because whatever grows there has to be able to handle lots and lots of sun, because there's nothing for shade, right? Has to be able to handle not having a lot of moisture, because there's no soil to hang on to the moisture. Like there's no roots or anything in the system to keep the moisture there, right? It can't have a huge biomass, right? Because it has to be able to sustain itself with minimal amounts of nutrients. But after a period of time of having little tiny organisms there, eventually we get this little tiny layer of soil. And eventually those abiotic conditions change enough that we can have different organisms there. And then that'll affect abiotic, which then affects which biotic factors there are. And on we go. And we keep going through this circle of abiotic affecting biotic affecting abiotic. Whoops. We keep going through this until we get to this climax community where we don't see a lot of change anymore. This community is pretty complex, right? And that's really what succession's all about. It's about going from a starting point with minimal stuff, right? Minimal organisms, minimal growth, over here to where we have this complex community with lots of relationships between a lot of different species, okay? And it maintains and stays fairly stable. All right, so let's talk about what that means. So succession, gradual progressive replacement of one intermediate community by another during vegetative development toward a final stable community, also known as a climax community, okay? So what do we need to know? Well, we need to know what the word succession means, of course, right? It's gradual changes, and we need to know that succession ends in what's called a climax community, right? And it's a nice stable community that kind of stays that way for a long period of time, okay? How succession happens is influenced by abiotic factors, right? How much sunlight there is, nutrients in the soil, whether there's humidity available. All of those types of factors are influenced by how the succession can happen. Okay, so when succession starts, we start with what's referred to as the pioneer species, right? So that's the very first species that's able to grow during succession. Now, we're going to learn as we go a little further along that there's two types of succession. There's primary succession and there's secondary succession. What I'm looking at here, whoops, what I'm looking in that first image, this is primary succession. What that means, and we'll take notes on it in a minute, is that there's no soil. This is an area that's just brand spanking new. There's absolutely no soil to speak of. So soil has to be built, okay? Things have to change in order to allow soil. And our very first species that we tend to see on an area that's just rock is lichen. Lichen and moss. So we can see little hints of lichen kind of growing, all that greeny stuff there. It's rock that's underneath it. It's hard to tell from the picture, but that's all lichen. The other type of succession is called secondary succession, and that's what we see in this image here. And that's where we still have soil. So this is a situation where we might have a forest fire has occurred, which is what we see in that image, or maybe we've had a big flood, something that's wiped out a lot of these organisms in the area, okay, vegetation and animals, but we're still left with enough soil that we're not starting from zero, right? We're not starting from just pure rock, okay? Regardless of whether we're starting with primary succession or secondary succession, our primary species still have fairly, oops, I need my mouse here, still have some characteristics, right? They have a low biomass. So over here in this image, we were talking about lichen and moss, right? Over here, one of the very first species we see after a forest fire is fireweed. And it's a thin weed with a purple flower, but again, a low biomass. And if you guys forget what biomass means, basically it's if we take the water away, what are we left with, right? So if we take the water away from lichen, we're not left with a lot of mass. If we take all the water away from a fireweed, again, we're not left with a lot of mass, not like we would be if we had like an oak tree, for example, okay? Pioneer species are drought tolerant because there's not anything really to hang on to the water. So they tend to be drought tolerant, okay? Because they're the ones that are putting the roots in. They're the ones that are going to be able to hold that water in. And sun tolerant because typically there's nothing to provide shade for them. So they usually have to be able to be tolerant to the sun, okay? So the pioneer species, the initial community, and then what that's going to do is that's going to end up changing the soil because it could break the rock apart. Because when it dies, it's going to provide nutrients to the soil, right? And it changes the conditions. So if we look at the picture on the right, we have some area where maybe some insects can live, right? They're going to defecate and die. That's going to add nutrients to the soil. These little plants are going to eventually die. They're offering some shade for maybe some other organisms to be there, right? So they're changing some of those conditions over time. Seral communities, well, this is all the stuff in the middle, right? I start with a pioneer species. That's where we start. We end with the climax community. So the seral communities are all the different changes that happen in the middle, right? So that's what that's referring to. The climax community, complex community, stable, complex food webs, okay? The predominant species, the ones that are sort of prevailing in those climax communities tend to have a higher biomass. Oftentimes when we think about us, when we think about here in Alberta, our climax communities, we tend to be thinking about forested areas. So when we think about a climax community, that's one that has lots of fir trees or poplar trees, right? Doesn't mean it doesn't have grass anymore. It still has some of those low biomass organisms, but it also has organisms with large biomasses, right? So we want to remember that these communities have all stages. There's a lot of overlap that's happening here. Okay, so species from all stages may be present at the same time. It just means that our predominant species are the big ones that have more of a biomass. Now, here where we are, forests is kind of what we're looking at a climax community. That's not the same thing as, say, if we're looking at Death Valley, a desert in the United States. That climax community will never be a forest, right? It doesn't have the climate for that. So the climax community is going to vary depending on where you are on the planet. Okay. So I wanted to put just a couple different examples of climax community here for you. So we see here, this is kind of where we're at, right? We tend to have these forested areas is our climax community. Over here, we're looking at the savanna. This is a climax community there, right? They're not going to have poplar trees and they're not going to have fir trees. That's not the climate for it. Their climax community has, we see lots of grassland in the savanna. We see these types of trees here, these shrubs in the savanna. And then over here, this is something more what we would see in Death Valley, right? But this would be a climax community in a Death Valley. We've got these big biomass organisms, which are the big cacti, right? We have some shrubs, small shrubbery. So the point for showing this to you is even though this is what we're most familiar with, this forested area here in Alberta, climax communities will vary depending on what part of the planet we're looking at, okay? All right. So the difference between primary and secondary succession. Okay, so I talked about it, but we'll just go through the notes on it here. Primary succession. So when we talk about primary succession, really what we're really thinking about is it's an area that didn't have vegetation. Okay, so there's very little to no soil with primary succession. So if we look at the bottom, the prime examples of this when we think about primary succession, newly formed volcanic islands. So that's what Hawaii was. That's what Iceland was, right? Land revealed from the retreat of glaciers is also an example of primary succession, right? Because when the glacier pulls back, it pulls all of the stuff back and we're down with just bare rock underneath. So that's also an example of primary succession. You can see this in different parts. You don't have to go very far. One thing that I would totally recommend to you guys one day when the borders are open back up and you have an opportunity to travel is to go to Idaho. Not very far away from us, but Idaho has this whole volcanic area, and it's a national site. It's called the Craters of the Moon Monument, National Monument. Okay, and it's in Idaho. And it's this volcanic area. And once you get there, it's just black as far as the eye can see, which is the basalt from the volcano. And because the volcanic ash landed and made such a thick layer, that means that the vegetation, there's no real soil for it to grow on because it's just all rock. So you can see where finally some organisms are starting to grow because this volcano happened about 2,500 years ago or longer. So we see slowly little bits of vegetation, and then there's lots and lots of caves to do splunking, etc. So strongly recommend going there because when I went there, it's primary succession. It's a really good example of that, and it's only about a 12-hour drive from here. All right. So soil is lacking or non-existent. Pioneer species, so the job of the pioneer species is to develop the soil, right? That's what they have to do. So the soil's developed so other vegetation can come over. So what that means is they're going to put roots in the soil so the soil can hang on to some water, right? They're going to provide some shading so other species don't have to have the direct sunlight. So those types of things are going to happen. They're going to provide nutrients to the soil when other species need more nutrients. All right. So primary succession starts with rock and ends up with a stable ecosystem. So in this example for this slide, we're talking about like Alberta, right, where we're going to get a forest. So first organisms, we have lichen. Lichen can be carried by the wind or from birds. Our pioneer species, we want to remember, these are the guys that can handle places that aren't very hospitable, right? Direct sunlight, not a lot of soil, etc. There we go. And then slowly over time, they change the conditions so different species can grow. And then those ones will slowly over time change the conditions so another species can grow, and so on. All right, so this is kind of our example from our area. So what we can see with this example is we're starting with lichen, right? So that's going to break up some rocks, allow for a little bit other species to grow, change the conditions. So now we have moss. And then moss is going to change the conditions. So then we have some grasses can grow. And then there'll be enough soil to allow for ferns and shrubs to grow. And then some trees, some smaller trees, some thicker trees. And we see our soil is getting more and more roots in it, which means it's going to hang on to water a lot more, right? Now, that's not to say we're not going to still have grass. We see that there's still bits of grass here, right? So we still have low biomass organisms, but we have a lot of high biomass organisms. Now, this image just looks at the vegetation, but you have to imagine that we also have animals are going to be part of this as well, right? We'll have small insects here. We'll start getting some birds. Larger species will start taking advantage. And then they die and defecate, and that changes the conditions of the soil as well. Okay. All right. Secondary succession. So secondary succession, rebuilding of an area that once supported a stable community. Okay, so we already have some soil. Soil might have been damaged, but we have a starting point. We're not starting from rock. Okay, so this will be faster than primary succession because you don't have to go through that whole process of breaking rock down into soil. So examples of this, we see flood, okay, or forest fires. So if we start a fire, right, we can cause secondary succession to occur. If we have landslides in an area, a big thing, we see that these trees in my image here are cut nicely. Deforestation, right? We cut down our forests. Well, that's an example of secondary succession that we cause. Okay. All right. So secondary succession, and again, we're considering what's happening in an area like Alberta, right? So occurs in developed communities that have been disturbed. So because a disturbance doesn't remove the soil or destroy all organic matter, grass and shrubs can grow pretty quickly, right? So for us, if we have a forest fire, fireweed tends to grow here. So here's what we're starting with. So if we're talking about secondary succession, here's our climate, oops, sorry guys. We're starting with a climax community, right? So here we have trees, nice climax community, then we have a fire. Well, we still have soil, but immediately we're not gonna have poplar trees grow, right? The conditions of the soil have to be adjusted. There needs to be nutrients added to it. So that's where our fireweed comes in. And slowly we get larger and larger grasses and then some shrubs, and then we get some bigger trees, and eventually we get back to our climax community. But again, secondary succession happens a lot quicker simply because the soil doesn't have to develop. All right, that was a whole lot of talking from me. Any questions, comments, concerns, anything? All right. That is it for populations, guys. So again, I did post the worksheet yesterday. You should have everything you need to do that. Please remember that when I do these, when I do my posting for this the stream for Google Classroom, I do put a little reading from the textbook. It's not mandatory to read that, but because we don't have that same time in the classroom, it's just another resource to go to that if something's not clear to you. So I'm going to try to do that every time we have a lecture, just to give you some readings to do, just a place to look for some more information. All right. Okay, well, it looks kind of half decent outside today, so maybe get some time outside over the weekend. And that's it. We will see you guys on Monday. So don't forget to study for that populations quiz. And you guys are awesome, by the way. I just want to say that. You guys are fantastic. It's been a pleasure. You know, as much as we all hate this remote learning, it's been a pleasure to have you guys do this because you guys are so great. Okay, so have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.